Seller concessions don't show up randomly. When you actually look at the distribution, you can see how the market is negotiating. And today, I'm going to show you exactly what that looks like.
Welcome to ValuTalk, your source for property valuations, real estate insights, and what's really driving the market. And now here's Douglas.
All right, let's get into it. In the last episode, we said concessions aren't line items. Today, we're going to show you what that actually means in the data. So for this episode, I'm not breaking concessions down by type. Whether it's a closing cost, repair credits, or other seller paid items, the point here is that the value is being transferred. At the market level, how that value is labeled matters less than the fact that it exists. What I want to show you today is how to recognize concession behavior, how it shows up in the data, and how to account for it without overstating or understating your value. Most people think concessions just kind of pop up deal by deal, like something weird happened in the transaction, so a concession showed up. But when you actually step back and you look at the data, they're not random at all. They follow patterns, and once you see those patterns, you stop treating concessions like exceptions and you start treating them more like market behavior. The next thing to understand is that concessions don't show up evenly across all sales. Some transactions have none. Others have concessions that are large enough to matter. And it's that unevenness that's important because it tells you the market isn't making small compromises everywhere. It's making different decisions in different situations. This is where people get into trouble. They look at the average concession and assume that's what's typical. But averages can hide what the market is actually doing. A handful of larger concessions can pull that number up, even if a big chunk of the market has no concessions. So if you stop at the average, you can completely misread what's going on. That's why distribution matters. Before you talk about adjusting anything, you need to see how concessions are actually distributed. Where do they cluster? Where do they drop off? Are they scattered or are they concentrated in certain ranges? The picture tells you far more about market behavior than any single number ever could. And once you understand that pattern, time gives it context. Are concessions increasing? Are they stable? Are they fading? That's where concessions tie directly into market conditions. You're not guessing. You're watching how the market is negotiating over time. So, all right, with that framing in mind, let's look at what concessions actually look like in a real neighborhood. All right, so let's reset real quick on where we are. This is the older, more established neighborhood we talked about in the last episode. It's not this newer tract down here, not the builder-heavy area. This is the market with more age, more variation, more individual seller behavior. So let's bring up that raw data that we had from that neighborhood last time. What I want you to notice here isn't anything fancy yet. This is just the raw data. These are the actual concessions pulled from straight from the sales, nothing cleaned, nothing filtered beyond what we had already discussed. You can already see just by looking at it, concessions here range from 0 all the way up to around 20,000. And in between, you've got everything, 500, 700, 3,000, 10,000. At this stage, I'm not trying to interpretate anything yet. This is just to ground us in the reality of the data before we visualize it. So let's stop staring at rows and numbers and actually look at what this distribution is doing. All right, let's go ahead and load up our data and make the histogram. We're using that same data from the older neighborhood as before. This is the first pass, just the histogram itself. There's no curve, no assumptions. All this is showing us is counts. How often concession amounts show up in certain ranges. Right away, you can see a heavy concentration down here in the lower end. 0 concessions, very small concessions, a few $1,000s. That's where most of the activity is. Then you start seeing some gaps or ranges where a few other sales occurred. Then you got another pocket of higher activity, $10,000, $12,000, but far fewer transactions. That's important because it's already telling us something. It's an uneven distribution of concessions in this neighborhood. They're clustered. Most sales are happening with smaller concessions, and then you got a thinner tail stretching out here to the right. So let's overlay a curve, not to force meaning, but to help visualize the shape. You hear people call this a bell curve, which is fine conversationally, but technically this is a normal distribution curve. It's just a visual reference, not a claim that the data is normal. When we lay a curve over a histogram, on this particular histogram, you can see right away this is not a symmetrical distribution. The tail stretching to the right. This is what we call a right skewed. A small number of high concessions are pulling the distribution in that direction. That skew shows up immediately when you look at the average and the median too. The mean is sitting way higher up here around 6,200, while the median is sitting lower around 4,750. That tells us the average is being influenced by those larger concessions amount on the high end. The median is doing a better job of representing where most transactions actually fall. At this point, we're not talking about adjustments. We're not saying what number to use. We're just learning the behavior of concessions in this market. Now that we've seen how the concessions are distributed overall, the next step is to look at how individual sales sit within that distribution. And that's where a box and whiskers plot comes in handy. All right, let's go ahead and load up our data for the box and whiskers plot. The same data we've been using across all the analysis that we've been doing. We're looking at concessions in this box and whiskers plot. The box right here is the interquartile range. This is the middle 50% of the market, not the extremes, not the noise. This is where most transactions are actually happening. If I'm trying to understand typical market behavior, it's this box that matters more than the average. But notice something important here. The lower quartile range starts at 0. That means at least 25% of the sales had no concessions at all. So concessions aren't universal. They're present, but they're not mandatory, at least not for participation in this market. Now look at the top of the box. The upper quartile range is just under $11,000. That tells us that 75% of the market is at or below this level. Once you get above this range, you're no longer looking at typical market behavior. You're looking at exceptions. And then you've got the tail. These are higher concession amounts exist. This is where they are, but they're not representative of the whole market. This is why blindly adjusting off the highest concession can distort value. They're real, but they're not common. So the box plot tells us where concessions concentrate, but it doesn't tell us whether the behavior is changing. That's where time comes in. So now we've looked at shape with the histogram, we've looked at concentration with the box plot, and the next question is always time. Are concessions changing, or are they just part of the background of this market? We're going to take the same data set that we've been working with, nothing new here, because the goal isn't to find a different answer. It's to see how the same behavior looks when we layer time on top of it. So what this regression is doing is very simple. We're plotting concessions over contract date and asking one basic question. Is there a directional change here? The short answer is no. This line is essentially flat. There's no meaningful upward pressure. There's no meaningful downward pressure. That tells us concessions in this neighborhood aren't reacting to time. They're part of how this market functions. The R squared here is basically 0, and that's actually the point. Time isn't explaining concession behavior. What explains concessions in this market is distribution and concentration, not trend. So when concessions are stable across time like this, you don't treat them as a market condition adjustment. You treat them as a market characteristic. They affect individual transactions, but they're not signaling a changing market. Okay, before we wrap this up, I want to show you a quick contrast using the data from the newer neighborhood. Same framework, same tool, just a different market. We're not going to walk through this in the same way. I just want you to see the distribution. In this newer neighborhood, you can see the difference immediately. Concessions are heavily clustered up here at this upper end. There's very little activity at the lower end and a lot of consistency near the top. Here, the median is actually higher than the mean, which tells you this market isn't being pulled up by a few large concessions. This is the norm. So it isn't about whether concessions exist, it's about how they exist in a given market. Same tool, different distribution, different story. All right, back here in the office, let's wrap this up. This episode wasn't about finding a concession adjustment, it was about understanding concession behavior. When you step back and you put all three views together, the histogram, the box plot, and time, you start to see concessions for what they really are. They're structured behavior, not noise. They don't show up randomly. They don't show up evenly. They don't always tell you the same story from one market to the next. We saw in the established neighborhood, concessions were spread out with a wide range and a long tail. Some sales had none, some had a lot, but most lived in the middle of the band. In the newer neighborhood, it was just the opposite. Concessions were concentrated, they were consistent, they were clearly part of how that market operated. Concessions don't automatically equal market change. Sometimes they reflect changing market pressure, and sometimes they're just how buyers and sellers are doing transactions in that market. The mistake is jumping straight to average or dollar amounts without understanding the distribution or the context of the concessions. If you don't know how concessions behave in a market, you don't know what they're telling you. The framework always stays the same. Look at the distribution, look at the concentration, then look at time. What changes is the behavior. So come back, because in the next episode, we're going to step back, talk about market conditions, how prices move over time, and how things like strategy and concessions can either confirm or mask that movement. Until next time, I'm Douglas. Stay curious, stay sharp, and always stay focused on value.
ValuTalk is produced by Data Hub Solutions. For tools, insights, and more, visit our website at datahubsolutionsllc.com. Stay informed, stay ahead.